Topology is one of the most annoying processes to learn. I personally had a very hard time learning when I was a beginner. In this video I'm gonna try to summarize all of the most important parts of this topic. So the first thing, know when you actually need a good topology. Nobody will tell you this as a beginner, but in my opinion most people over-glorify a good and clean topology when sometimes you don't really need that. It might seem obvious, but you only need a clean topology if your topology is giving you any problem of any kind. Feel free to have a triangulated mesh or even decimating your mesh in some cases. If this mesh is not deforming or giving you any problem of any kind, you're good. In general, what I do is I'm always testing while I'm making the topology. So if I have a prop, I'm always exporting to Unity or Unreal to see if I'm gonna have any shading problem in Unity or Unreal. Or the same thing for characters, I'm gonna check if I'm gonna have any problem with deformation in any kind. Make sure to test all the time and you're gonna be fine. So the first thing we're gonna talk about is loops and support loops. So for this, I'm gonna be using this character as an example. This character is a character we made for our Unity asset store. So today I'm gonna be using this as an example. Just so we can understand what loops are going to be these guys in here. They are a set of faces that are connected to each other and that finish the same place that they began. Basically, they are isolated, and when I select the loop, I can select the loop in Blender by pressing Alt and selecting the face. I'm going to be selecting just this circle here. One of the most important things about our character topology is the loops. We're gonna have loops all around our characters, and the way to make a clean topology for our characters is to understand how loops work and learning how to control them. So the first thing about loops and the way we want loops to look like is for them to be isolated. Not the loop itself, but like a set of loops being isolated. An example of this would be like this arm. We don't want these loops in here to be going somewhere else. And that would happen if you do something like this, for example. This loop is not closed basically, because instead of finishing the same place that they began, they're finishing somewhere else. They're going to the other side of the body. And we don't want that most of the times. And there's a couple of reasons to that. First reason is that the way that the arm is going to be deformed, that's not how the arm is going to be deformed. It's going to be deformed like pieces by pieces. So the way this bone would deform, if I would make a proper weight paint here, it starts deforming by this side of the bone and finishes deforming on this side, and nothing else matters to this bone. So I have to guarantee that the loops that this bone is interacting with, they are isolated on this part of the mesh as much as I can. That doesn't work for all of the time, but most of the time I have a lot of control over that, so I want to be mindful of this. The other reason for that is actually not even related to deforming, but mostly about making this character being easier to edit this character basically. Because for this character, for example, we might want to make this taller, and to do that, if this was not isolated the way it is now, I couldn't just do this and add the extra cuts in here. Then I'm basically done. I would have to have a lot more work to do a basic thing like this. That's why it's good to keep this clean loops around the most important parts of the character. And so how to test our loops? The way I test my loops is by using this loop cut tool here in Blender. And the loop cut usually is just to cut a few more loops to the character, but that's not what I'm gonna do. It's just to test. I can just put the loop and pretend that I'm gonna cut something here, but it's just to see if I have a proper loop around the places that I want to have. And I can see that most of the places it is working fine. And I can see that here, for example, that's not the way I would want this to be. So let's take a look to see if we can find out why this is happening. We can see that the way we should do this topology is, the way it's happening now, this loop is coming here, and instead of going, it probably should be going to the top of the fingers, but instead it's going around the finger and then around the hand, and then goes to the top of the finger. We could avoid this easily if we just make this go directly into the top of the finger. And for this, if we need more edges here, we will take a look on how we can do this in the next parts of the video. And there's something about how many edges our loops should have. This is super important in some cases, but not all of them. The way I usually care about that is for things like fingers. In here, it's closing in triangle triangles. I don't like that because I don't like the aspect of it. So I would close in quads. I probably can use grid fill for this, and I can crease one here. And yeah, so the way I decide the amount of edges here is so I can close this in quads instead of triangles. It looks a lot better if we do like that. In general is numbers that are multiplier by 2 that can be closed like that. There are some specific situations that it doesn't matter that much. I've noticed that like for this and all of this, they are okay. For the head is 20 edges. And since we have the mirror modifier here, we can have 5 edges on each side, and we have 6 here. And because of that, we have more faces here. And then 20 wouldn't be enough if we want for this to have all of them to have the same amount of edges. So we will have to increase from 20 to 24. Then we will have 2 more edges on each side of the character. But for this character specifically, his head is not a perfect circle, so it's okay. We can use like that because it's actually the amount of edges that we need on each side. And when that's the case, it's okay to use a different number of edges. That will depend on the character and on the situation. But it's good to keep in mind anyway. And about this, what I call support loops. Support loops for characters are these kind of loops here. In this case specifically, it's not made perfectly. They should not have this kind of deformations because it's already going to deform when you start animating. So we want here to have as less deformation as we can. Same thing for here, like this could be completely straight, and that will help a lot when we are animating. Same thing for here. It will have some kind of deformation because of the form of the character and the arm, but it should not make this curves like that. It should be something more like, just an example, like this. You should be straighter. Okay, so the next topic is about bevels. Bevels, they're not going to be necessary on all of the cases in all of the model, any project. But the thing about bevels is that it helps as a kind of a shading loop, because it will help the bake if you are going to bake, or it's going to help the look on engine when you bring your model to the engine. So in general, it will help the normals to look more consistent. So the way you can do this is, in general, you're going to decide that depending on the characteristics of your project and the poly count you're aiming for. If you're thinking only about the model itself, sometimes what I do is I only use bevels on the places that I think is more important for the model, and the rest I can just ignore. And here, for example, I didn't feel like this would matter much for the bevel. That's the kind of thing that you can just decide on whether maybe it's on the bottom of the model or it's somewhere that is more hidden. And this, for example, is like it's on the front of the model, and it's definitely gonna be seen. So you probably want to add a bevel here. Yeah, in this model specifically, I used bevel quite a lot, but yeah, I could definitely delete some of them. Whether to use it or not will depend on the characteristics of the project, the poly count you're aiming for, and this kind of things. So triangulation. Triangulation for the environment, you can triangulate as much as you can, and when it's a matter of saving a few polys, you actually should triangulate. You should always be testing in the engine to see if your triangulation is going to cause any shading problems. So while you're modeling, always make sure to be bringing that to Unity or Unreal to see if there's any kind of problems in your shading. On the other side, for characters, you still can triangulate, but you should be more mindful of that, since characters are gonna be deforming. Triangulation can cause a few problems here. So the way you should deal with that is, if you can deploy triangulation in some specific part of your models, you should try to bring this triangulation to somewhere that it's gonna have less deformation. Some places, for example, is gonna be, I don't think I have the bone anymore, but okay, if you just think that there's a bone here, we can see that this part here, for example, that's not gonna be deforming as much as this, or this, or this. That is gonna be the end and the start of each bone. These parts are gonna be a lot more important about the formation, so we wanna avoid having triangulation there. That's about it. Okay, so about loop control. Again, about loops, and as I said, it's one of the most important parts of your topology. So loop control is gonna be one of the things that are gonna be more useful for you. this mesh here, it shows you the example of each of these loop controls that you have the option of using. And if you go to our character here, we'll see a lot of parts that are going to be using this. One of them is this, for example, that is going to be transforming 2 edges into 4. And that what loop control is if you need more edges, you know how to kind of make edges out of nowhere, you know? And that way it's basically like I could do the same if I had, instead of making this loop control, I only like would add 2 more loops here, but this way I would be adding this here that I don't need. So it's less performant if you do this way. That would be the way to do that. So just so as an example, I'm gonna actually try to replicate this on another plane so you can take a look how this was done. So the first thing, I'm gonna add 5 cuts here, and I'm gonna add a few cuts here. Okay, so the first kind of loop control, I'm gonna be going from 5 edges to 3, and the way I do that is by simply, first I'm gonna make sure that I only have 3 here, and then I'm gonna add an edge here. And here I went from 5 to 3 edges. I'm gonna just delete this. So I'm gonna do basically the same thing I did here. So I can go from 3 edges to 1. Okay, so we went from 3 to 1, and this is basically the same as this one. If you delete this one, it's actually the same thing. So next thing is transforming 1 edge into 2, and then you can transform these 2 edges into 4. Now I have the most important ways that you can control your loops, and you're gonna be using that all of the time in your character. But if I'm being completely honest with you, this is super technical, and it's not the kind of thing that goes through our mind while you're like all the time while you're making character topology. So the way I actually use this is usually I have references on like my second monitor, and I go to this when I have problems. On other moments, obviously, like I already know this, so I can use better modeling, but this is something that you have to think about it. So usually most of the character topology is not covered by these kind of things. So yeah, the way I do this is most of the character, I just make the topology naturally, and when I have problems, I come to this. This is the best way I found actually put this to use. That's about loop control. One thing I wanted to talk about in here, it's about the poles. The poles are gonna be these kind of vertices that are connected to more than 4 other vertices, like this one for example, that is connected to 5 others. Poles are not like a complex topic. It's just always good to keep in mind the same thing as triangulation, that you want to keep pole as much as you can on places that are not gonna be as deformed as the joints, for example. So a few things to avoid on your character is to have any kind of non-manifolds. And any gun will be like something like this face in here that has more than 4 vertices, and a non-manifold would be a mesh like this. Doesn't really make sense. It's going in a different direction than it should be. This is the kind of things that you want to avoid, and for you to make sure that you don't have this in your character, you can go to select all by trade and faces by side, and if you put this to greater than, it's going to be selecting all of your any guns in your character. Now same thing for the non-manifold, it's going to be selecting your non-manifolds. You might want to select boundaries sometimes. For this I don't have actually, so that's okay. Always check this before exporting. So a few environment common mistakes is to have some meshes that are not closed. So things like this, for example, that you can see, and usually the way I see this is going to the viewport overlay and going to face direction, and where I can see the red that I didn't close well enough, you want to make sure that this is not opened. On top of that, mesh is clipping. This might be a good example for this. This weapon in here is kind of high poly because I didn't care much about poly count here, so it might not matter as much, but sometimes what is good to do is to make sure that your edges are the same for the objects that are being combined together. So this way you're not gonna be seeing this clipping from one model to the other. So for the characters, some of the most common mistakes, and one of the most important, is gonna be the joints, not paying enough attention to the joints. Same thing here, sometimes we might wanna do things like this. This is gonna make sure there's not gonna be any clipping here when this arm is gonna be closing. This will depend a lot from project to project and the kind of animations that each characters are gonna have. But the quad size too. Usually we want to keep the size of the quads consistent, not only because of deformation, because things like this, it's gonna be deforming too much. So we want to have a more consistent quad size for this kind of things, but also for amount of detail. So if there's, and for things like this, for example, we will want this to be straight. There's no reason for that. And in here, we will have to find a solution, maybe even making this smaller. That way we will have a smoother topology, and we will keep the same amount of detail for all the character. So same thing for the arm, we will do this for the arm. And yeah, by the way, these kind of things in here, for example, it's deforming a little bit too much. It's okay to have some kind of, since the character has this shape, it's okay to just follow the shape. But in this case, for example, we could have avoid that and just have a straighter line here would be better. Confusing loops. So all of these loops that are things like this, it's always good to avoid. But also these loops that are like this ones, this one, the way this one is right now, for example, like things like this sometimes, or this one in here that could be like this, you know, this kind of things is good to keep in mind. Always good to remember to close the meshes the same way as environment ones, and to keep more spaces between the clothes and the rest of the body too, because in here on the top it's a little bit too close to the rest of the body, and the clothes themselves are too close to each other. They actually are clipping, so we want to avoid having this in here too. Some more practical quick tips here. Usually I use only subdivision surface first, and that way it helps a lot because you don't have to extrude all of this, I don't know, these 24 faces in here. You don't have to extrude all of these 24 faces in here. You only have to extrude 12 maybe, or even less, and you use shrink wrap, and that is going to be attaching this to the rest of the body. A lot easier to do topology like that. And the other tip is always use references. Honestly, I wouldn't be able to make a good topology if I'm not using enough references. Always when I go into something that is too detailed, I have references on my second monitor to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. And the last tip is to always model the borders of the character and or any kind of model first. So the way I would do is I'll do the main loops. So I talked about the sets of loops in the beginning. So I would only model like the first of them like this, and the first of this like this one, the first of the leg, and the first of the belly, and all of this. And then I would connect all of them, modeling the borders, the silhouette of the character. And then I would worry about connecting after I have everything actually retopologized and all of the character in its place. Then I would start thinking about connecting them, and that's when I would start thinking about this guy in here. Thank you for watching this video. If you like, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you feel like I missed any part of the topic, leave that in the comment and I might consider making a new video about it. Thank you.